When it comes to product security, there are not a lot of answers yet, right? We have a lot of information, but we don't have a strong path on within our organization, how do we actually solve these problems? I think, yeah, neither of them are exclusive of each other. You can be both smart and curious, but that's why I wait a lot more when it comes to curiosity, because to find the answer to something that we don't know about yet, like a definitive answer, like in product security all the time, right? You have to be able to make a lot of mistakes and learn from those things and enter this brand new territory over and over again. So a curious team is going to position the organization with more novel approaches in terms of how to solve those security problems. And then because of that, you have a little bit more persistent vigilance on your security posture. Someone's always poking around saying, how can we do better here?
Welcome to Season 4 of The Elephant in AppSec, the podcast to explore, challenge, and boldly face the AppSec elephants in the room. I'm Alexandra, your host, AppSec enthusiast, and growth manager at Escape. Today, I'm joined by Maxwell Zhou, the founding partner of PolarStar Cybersecurity Group, cybersecurity firm focused on helping fintech organizations strengthen their product security. Throughout his career at Greenlight, Visa, and T-Mobile, Maxwell has specialized in penetration testing, vulnerability assessments, and secure coding practices. He's particularly excited about building world-class security programs that scale with hyper-growth organizations. In this episode, we discuss one of Maxwell's articles on the traits of healthy security programs, diving into what healthy really means. We also explore the concept of security debt, how it can lead to increased incidents over time, and the importance of having a pentesting background when it comes to understanding which vulnerabilities truly matter. If you enjoyed this podcast, don't forget to subscribe and follow it on your favorite podcasting app or YouTube. It's the best way to avoid missing future episodes. And with that, get ready to hear Maxwell's opinions. Dive right in. Hi, Max. I'm super excited to have you on Elephant in AppSec with me today. Thank you so much for joining and for coming on the show to share your experience. You've been for quite some years already in AppSec. I worked as a member in penetration testing, consulting as well, and now you're a security engineer. I think I saw some of your articles as well on PolarStar Cyber website, where you kind of described what are the different key traits, of a healthy security program and or how to approach product security in general. So kind of guide for people who want to get started. But for every organization, the definition of healthy is potentially different, and how people can consider what is healthy varies, from one work to another. And it could be great, to know what is actually healthy security program for you.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you for inviting me on the podcast. I'm excited to talk about these topics. Yeah, I've been thinking about these and working through these my entire career. So I think before answering that question, like when it comes to product security, when I look at it and from the lens I see it from, and especially for SaaS companies, right? Your business is surrounded around your product. Without your product, you have nothing to sell.
Yeah.
Product security, when I look at it, it's not really just a matter of compliance. It's a cost of doing business. So the overall goal for our product security teams and programs are really to develop a strong practice so that we can identify, reduce, and mitigate business risk. And really that whole purpose is to accelerate our revenue growth and reduce long-term overhead costs. So it's almost, I don't want to say that it's a luxury to have product security, right? But you don't really invest in product security until your product has really taken off and okay, I do have something really valuable here. So when we look at security as a whole, every department manages some form of risk. So CFOs manage risk of money coming in the org, CPOs manage, the risk of talent coming in and out of the org. And when we look at CISOs and when we're looking at security, right, they manage the risk of the data that us as an organization, we own and manage. So it's a pretty difficult job, but it's really about architecting. And so the whole reason from the healthy traits is to kind of tailor the architecture of the organizational system that's supporting them to address and communicate security risk. Because our security leaders, our CISOs, they are not the ones who are doing the work day in, day out, right? They have only a couple of tools to their disposal, and really that comes down to governance, process, and the system. And so the system in this definition is a collection of all of the processes that support their security program. So finally, to answer your question, a healthy security program communicates the organization's security risk posture and directly guides strategic resourcing decisions. So I think that Those traits, they come down to having curiosity, empathy, engagement, consistency, continuous improvement, and business alignment. So those are kind of the biggest traits that I have seen that are what allow a security team to be able to be effective. And by doing so, are really able to cement security's seat at the table as a strategic business partner. So all us on the teams, whether it's from enterprise security, product security, or compliance as well, right? Reflecting those traits within your organization helps our security leaders to be able to communicate all the value that we're doing for the team.
Yeah, I think it's interesting that you mentioned that it's only once you have product, that you start thinking
Yeah,
about security. I think sometimes in a certain types of like startups or small organizations, for them, actually security is one of the can be potentially one of the reasons why they're selling what they're selling. Like if it's a financial, organization, if they don't have certain compliance requirements, and they will even not be able to sell, even though some small things, like SOC 2,
right.
for us, like a security vendor, is just a must. While
Yes,
I
yeah.
my friends and actual family members who work in startups, and they ask me, "Wait, do you already have SOC 2?" And yes, we have to. Well, they're just already like much mature organization and just start thinking about it because they work with others. How do you think, for example, compliance fits an idea, of a healthy security? Because it's not specifically one of the soft skills like curiosity, empathy. How do you think like compliance requirements fit in there?
Yeah, absolutely. I think that's a great question. And when it comes to compliance, for me, this comes back down to that same trait of consistency. So when a security leader sets a requirement, by definition, this means that it's a non-negotiable. So kind of in the example that you talked about, right? Not having SOC 2 compliance or not having a certain control or not having SSO as a product feature, right? We cannot work with certain organizations. So um, kind of an example I like to use is like if I'm looking for an apartment and I say parking is a requirement, it's a non-negotiable. If the person who I'm working with finds me an apartment that doesn't have parking, so I really, no matter how awesome this thing is, the cool loft and great price, right? I can't live here. So that kind of comes back down to the same thing when it's when we're looking at security, and I think one of the kind of areas that we end up seeing in security programs that become fuzzy is, interestingly enough, a lot of it comes down to almost the way that we use our language and how we measure our effectiveness, right? So you'll often see things where a requirement is being communicated or a security weakness is actually being communicated as a requirement. So we start to see some tensions rise between teams because they say, well, you say it's a requirement, but I cannot do this right now, right? I don't have the
Hmm.
resources to do this. I cannot fulfill this requirement. And that kind of serves as a feedback loop for us if we're building our relationships properly with our counterparts across the organization, so we can understand, is this a resourcing problem, or is this like an unrealistic expectation? Do we have a technology problem that we need to invest in, or is it really a requirement? Right? Because if we can still do business without it, then we have to outweigh the costs. Working with our security leader and our business partners on saying, is this something we really care about doing today?
Yeah, do you think that sometimes it might create, certain depth, like security depth in a sense, maybe like a, Godzilla that analogy, right? Before that, it's kind of dormant till a certain point, and then it
Yeah,
just erupts. Like
yeah.
it's a good, trade-off for that.
Yeah, that's awesome because there is absolutely security debt. Just like when you have technical debt come in from your engineering side, security debt is very similar. It's really the same, however, has a separate impact, right? So when it comes to a security debt, it increases our likelihood for some form of a security incident, whether we know about it or not. But it does increase the likelihood of that event from happening as we grow as an organization. We look at a smaller organization. So it's been really interesting kind of seeing companies from kind of that small startup phase and under 30 people, and then they've got some really interesting product on their hand they're starting to build. You'll end up seeing, even in a lot of these types of organizations, that there will have to be a lot of trade-offs that get made as to, do we build this thing the right way right now, or do we get this shipped out tomorrow? And I think we all like to think from an engineering standpoint and engineering excellence that we will do the right thing today, but oftentimes what happens is maybe we have our CEO or a marketing officer our CMO needs to go to present a demo at this new conference in like 3 weeks, right? And so because there's a huge demo coming up with lots of either investors or potential customers coming up, we will make a different decision. What's going to happen. And from a risk standpoint, you might say, cool, like this will open up a lot of doors for us, but we will then need to kind of do a quick follow. And then it's not to say this is a bad thing, right? This is just what happens in a smaller organization when you're moving very quickly. The practice that we as security teams need to make sure that we're doing well with to support this is not to say, cool, like ship off whatever and we'll have a good day. But it's more so about, okay, based on what we're seeing right now, what's the current risk that we have? And based off of that, what is the timeline or the requirements that need to be met for us to finally start doing something about it? And I think that from a practice standpoint, most teams, they'll do a great job at being able to say, this is a problem. The part where they kind of, and even some teams even better are able to then document this and say, this is on this date, we found these things. We know we need to address this. But that whole life cycle of coming back to it and actually revisiting it and resurfacing it often isn't super strong. We end up seeing it until an incident pops up or some similar problem and go, oh, I remember 2 years ago, we wrote this thing and we knew this was going to happen. This for me, like kind of leans back down into like, what is, when I talk about those healthy traits, none of them actually have to do with the technical execution itself, because it's less so. I've noticed that it's never really a technical problem that we're truly just trying to solve. Technical solutions exist for these technical problems, right? But to make this whole system hum comes back down to, process engineering and making sure that we as a security department, we do a good job with creating resilient processes that help us to keep these habits and strengthen them over time.
What's your definition of resilient process?
Yeah, resilient. Yeah. So for me, I look at processes from whenever I'm looking at a security program, I'm actually really less concerned about how good they are doing today, right? Because the inevitable outcome is that you should be doing better in the future as well. And I also compete in like powerlifting. So that's like kind of my side thing that I do. And I actually have learned a lot from those practices in competitive powerlifting to, oddly enough, security programs, right? And so when you look at like your body on how to get stronger and how to do things, the beginning phase, like just like when we start our security program, anything will work, right? Just caring a little bit and starting to do something is going to work. But if you want to get to that next stage, every single incremental level of, the maturity levels, right? Which is a project I'm working on as well, which we can talk about later. But when you look at a product security program's maturity levels, each one is almost like an exponential level of investment to commit to. So that beginning phase is just, okay, I'm going to start thinking and start doing it, start doing something about it, right? And then next is, okay, I'm going to start measuring that I'm doing something, whether it's an accurate measurement, whether it encompasses full coverage or not, doesn't matter. I'm just going to start to measure so I understand the problem that I have. And then from there, starting to build out a feedback loop through your process. So a really basic example might be based off of the even inaccurate metrics that I'm getting, right? I can at least make a decision as to, do we need to invest additionally into new tooling, or do we need to, commit a certain amount of time, or, purchase a tool for it, or get more resourcing, hiring on our team so that we can meet this work requirement that we have. But when I look at what a resilient process means, it means that you're able to, one, communicate what is the value of this whole work stream that we're doing. And then second, based off of this work stream, what can we do about it to augment the metrics that we need, either up or down as needed. And then thirdly is when we talk about the value of it, I think a lot of security professionals, especially in ProdSec, who are extremely technical when their foundation is technical, right? So I often see kind of a challenge with that component where it's difficult to then translate, I'm doing X amount of security reviews into this is delivering X amount of value for the company, or I'm finding X amount of vulnerability. This is providing X amount of value, other than just saying, oh, we've reduced reputational damage or reputational risk, financial risk.
Yeah, I think it's very hard sometimes to tie very operational metrics to the global risk of the company and translate it, into the dollar value. Sometimes it's probably sometimes easier to do it when you can kind of calculate the efficiency of, like, let's say, how much time it saved then to remediate a vulnerability versus how much then developers coded something that benefited the company in the long run. But that's maybe where you define those metrics, where you mentioned one of the traits, I think, business alignment.
Hmm.
That's, I guess, the point where you kind of define, those metrics and tie it to the value that
Yeah.
you might bring. The first thing that you mentioned was curiosity, actually. Why curiosity was first
Yeah.
that you decided to define?
Yeah, curiosity for me. So actually one of the traits I didn't list out specifically is smart. And so the reason why is because, when I look at it, there's a difference between what curious and smart is. And so smart is really about being resourceful and having the quick wits to reference knowledge that you know about things that you've done before in the past or people you've worked with so that you can draw a conclusion. So that's a great thing to have. It's not to say don't have smart, right? But smart alone doesn't bring results. So what I've seen is that just being smart, it's a great thing to have. It's a great trait to have on your team, and you should expect it, right? You want to hire the best of the best. But what often happens is it results in analysis paralysis. And then you have this endless loop of anxious inaction because you're like, oh, this is could happen. This is the right thing, but this could also work. So there's just so much thought that's coming into it. And that's great. But when I really, through all the people I've worked with, smart people, they learn really quickly, which is great, right? But the difference is that when you add curiosity to that, someone who's truly interested in trying to find an answer, a curious person is going to find themselves in brand new territory that doesn't have an answer yet. And when it comes to product security, there are not a lot of answers yet, right? We have a lot of information, but we don't have a strong path on within our organization, how do we actually solve these problems? I think, yeah, neither of them are exclusive of each other. You can be both smart and curious, but that's why I weight a lot more when it comes to curiosity, because to find the answer to something that we don't know about yet, like a definitive answer, like in product security all the time, right? You have to be able to make a lot of mistakes and learn from those things and enter this brand new territory over and over again. So a curious team is going to position the organization with more novel approaches in terms of how to solve those security problems. And then because of that, you have a little bit more persistent vigilance on your security posture. Someone's always poking around saying, how can we do better here? How can we make sure that we are working with our engineering partners better? Or how can we amplify the effectiveness of our.
And for you, for example, what do you think about the younger generation, how they approach curiosity? Because, for example, I don't know if you had to mentor, in
Mhm.
your career, some of younger application security engineers. Did you see like the difference in the way they approach this? Because now with the rise, of AI, sometimes, like at least what I've experienced, a lot of young professionals kind of default, to the first they ask a question, they default to the
Yeah.
first answer, they don't search further. So it's kind of, in a sense, hinders innovation. Is it something that you've experienced as well?
Yeah, absolutely. I think that is definitely becoming a widespread, a widespread phenomenon. And I think that when we look at the baseline from the type of talent that's coming into the type of talent and the way that they think today compared to previously, the main difference is that for me that the main minimum technical baseline has improved only because they have quicker access to information, right? So when we go back to that similar trait, it doesn't exactly, it kind of mimics the smart trait, right?
Yeah.
Your ability to get information is much faster now. So everyone has more access to information. But that piece that still, whether it was 10 years ago and today, that separates what good and great looks like comes down to, does this person really think about how the system is working? Why the conclusion they got from ChatGPT, why that thing is actually, why it's valid or works in the way that it does. Because oftentimes, even when I'm working with it, I'll be like, hey, this is not right. This is not the sound logic path. And then it'll say, oh, yeah, you're right. Let me change my answer. So still looking for strong professionals comes down to finding, do they think one step or two steps deeper into why something works the way they do? And those that do, I think the biggest difference that you'll kind of see in how they go about their work is that rather than kind of waiting for instruction on how to get a certain task done, you'll see them being the ones who are actually designing and orchestrating how these systems will flow with each other, even because the technical abstractions from our new AI tools are kind of taking away the requirement of needing to know exactly how do I look up an IP, or how do I exploit this specific vulnerability, right? Or something of that nature. Then, or how do I know if it's actually reachable, right? It takes away some of that kind of mental load. And could they have done it without an AI tool? Absolutely. It just would have taken them a significant amount of time, and then after, without spending time on it, they would just be discouraged and be like, I don't want to spend 6 hours on one single ticket
Yeah, that's
researching this thing, so I'm gonna not do it.
that in a sense it's a little bit a problem as well because yeah, that's the considered, sometimes you need to spend those 6 hours of time to just understand also like how, let's say what you mentioned, the different flows are interconnected, like when you build an automation, as I saw you guys in it, you like build different automations with Dance, for example. You have to understand, system as a whole, because otherwise you just build something that might never also work, I know. Like for you, because you come as well from like pen testing experiences, I remember, like
Yep.
how did contribute to for you the way of understanding how different products are built and how
Mhm.
to find nitty-gritty details of vulnerabilities behind it?
Yeah, I started in pen testing actually, even in college. So actually, my first internship was in penetration testing during my freshman year.
Oh,
That's how I
okay.
got interested in the topic and spent basically all my time doing pen test work and security research on my own, since really the foundation of my technical discovery.
Yeah.
But I think one of the most useful skill sets I had learned from that was that when it comes to pen testing, especially when you're just poking around applications. And I had often poked around several live production applications, finding several different problems that I would communicate to them, and have gotten some good vacation funds out of that, I should say.
That's good for you.
Yeah, but I think one of the most interesting things I learned from that is none of the vulnerabilities I'd ever identified in the wild have really been super complex, right? Because in order to find a really super complex vulnerability, you have to either one, spend a lot of time and really deep knowledge into how that application works. So the only times I've really had the incentive to do that was when I'm working in a professional cadence, right? And I'm spending time specifically with the teams, and I'm ramping up a lot quicker in terms of how the system operates. But when you're pen testing from a pure black box perspective, you can only make a lot of assumptions. So based on the API structures that they have, based off what I've seen in the past, or based on maybe some reward system that they have, and I can say, okay, based on this reward system, they're submitting some form of an ID in here, right? And so there must be other IDs that
Okay.
exist. And then in order to get this list of IDs when you're testing, the next assumption I could make is there must be a way that at least have an API they can call to see what are the live active promotions that will show on your screen. That API exists somewhere. So those kind of like conclusions help you, I think, to learn about as an engineer. And, I'll also spend time, I'm not a great software engineer, but I will spend time writing software and working with that, even whether it's, some server that I need to host in order to perform some task, or whatever, or maybe if it's to support some of my exploitations that I have. So there'll be really basic web servers that I'll need to create. But really to think about, okay, if I'm an engineer and I'm coding this, what is the logic I would have put in when I worked with my engineering team and API designers and stuff? Like, what structure would I have had, and what type of information would be required? And I can also see the the HTTP requests and responses, and then determine we must use these parameters. And ideally, right, if we are not super fragmented, we'll use the same parameter names for these things.
Yeah.
So you can start to poke around and really learn a lot about the application. And I'd spend, let's say I had like a week long pen test engagement, or even I'm spending time poking around an application, I would spend at least a minimum of 1 to 2 days of just learning the APIs that I have available to me. And then based on those
Mm-hmm.
APIs, writing out test cases. Because I think the most, previous, way of doing pen test work before is you throw some scanner and then the scanner just does a bunch of stuff. It does a lot of fuzzing. If you're lucky, you'll find a few things. You'll find SQL injection. You'll find, maybe some cross-site scripting if it's a web app, or if you're really lucky, maybe find SSRF and can convert that to a remote
Yeah.
code execution. But if you wanted to really make that time efficient, then rather than just slamming the scanner out everything, we'd say, okay, based on these functions, this one uses an URL as input. So I'm going to test for SSRF specifically on this one. I won't care about it for maybe my name parameter, right? And then that allows you to be a lot more focused and tailored on what you're looking for. And, kind of going back into how this translated into working as a practitioner internally now on the defensive side. One of the most, I guess, almost frustrating things for me as a pen tester that I understand more.
Mhm.
When you start pure external, you look at these problems and you'll come back for the retest year after year, and a lot of the times you'll find the same problem over and over again. Whether they fix it or not, maybe they fix it, but you find it pop up again somewhere else. And then I guess my biggest question at the time, which is why I ended up, going to a different organization to practice internally, is to see, why do these problems keep showing up? Why can't they be solved so easily?
Okay.
And what I ended up finding is that when you're an internal practitioner, the pen test skills are super valuable, right? They allow you to identify problems really quickly, and you become an expert at that. But when it comes to finding holistic solutions, you as an external pen tester, you look at this thing and you go, cool, like this problem is prolific all over the place. But then you as an internal practitioner, you start solving very weird problems that says, who owns this API? And then for this API, what are we using for the authorization function, or what are we using for this specific function that is being handled? And then you have to kind of trace it back to find, do we have a centralized location for this? And you go, we have 6 fragmented solutions for this exact thing. And so that's where we see a lot of problems kind of show up, where it's not so much solving just like, you look at the OAuth guidelines, which I think are a really great resource, right? But it's not as simple as just fix this thing and here is some guidance from resources. It's more about, what is this pattern that we need to be able to follow and adopt over time? So security teams have so much to worry about at one time that, we have our pen tests happening, we have compliance stuff happening, we have some automations that we're working on, and then we have an incident that pops up. So you get distracted with
Hopefully
so
never.
many things. Exactly, yeah. So many things that pop up on a day-to-day basis, which makes the job exciting in some sense, but can also make it really difficult to be a master at some of these basics.
Yeah, I think the basics sometimes it is hard, especially for developers to learn, from the experience. As you mentioned, OWASP guidelines, they are indeed quite often quite generic. Like,
Yeah.
do that, go and look there. But it's in the end, each development framework is just so different. Each API is different. REST is going to be completely different from GraphQL and from SOAP and from gRPC. So there you have to kind of understand how to adapt each developer, your code to each vulnerability. And maybe, it's actually when you go and look up into the problems that keep popping up, it's the same person in the same repo every single time. So at least it helps that the problem is, right there.
Yeah, exactly.
For sure. But do you think, like, because as you mentioned, sometimes like pen testing takes a couple of days, then you have those issues that are maybe not systematic, but like one shot, something like that's automated, that can be also like automated fixed vulnerabilities, or automated even like fixing plus, I don't know, learning kind of curve pop-up solution. Would it be
Mhm.
eventually a solution for the industry, or how do you see that evolving
Yeah,
towards this?
absolutely. Yeah, I think when it comes to like automated security testing, it's a really tough market because I think you have kind of 2 areas to look at. One is, do we want to set up testing so that way we do have some basic coverage for all of our fuzzing, and it can do its best when it comes to identifying business logic flaws. But I think of all these things, no matter what tool we use, like the biggest challenge that we have is whether the tool is AI enabled or not, that has the capability to identify these flaws. Us as an organization, being a user of these tools, have to provide enough context to it so it understands what is reasonable, right? So if we start calling a specific function, it has to know that, hey, this function, it should only be allowed by admins, getting the receipts for this thing or getting the invoices should only be allowed by admins, but those who are in a different role, like a viewer role, shouldn't be able to see this thing. And then if you provide a tool that it doesn't really necessarily know it completely out of the box, and for every use case, for every company, every organization. So that's kind of the job on the user to provide. One of the methods that I've seen to be a little bit more to allow that kind of that growth and that evolution into it is
Mhm.
a lot of the times we spend security teams who are very anxious by nature, which is a good thing, right? To see, okay, what is the problem that could happen? And, kind of going back to our previous topic about analysis paralysis, right? Is that anxiety can cause us to not to just spend time looking for more problems, right? Because we're trying to discover everything that can happen that can go wrong. I don't think that's necessarily a bad thing to do, right? There's value in that. The question is, given the limited resources and time that we have, what is the most useful use of our time in our security program along its maturity journey? And so we'll often see someone just get stuck again, in that path of let's add more scanners, more things, when actually the first place that we can start is we have a list of problems that we know about. We have a list of vulnerabilities that we've identified in the past and have remediated. And when I look at some of the, especially for vulnerabilities that are coming from our pen tests, it's when one of the mistakes I often see is like when someone is evaluating a tool, they'll look at it and say, does this tool find me new vulnerabilities? And I'll guarantee you every tool will find you new vulnerabilities. If you
Yeah.
want to find more, you can find more, right? But for me, I'm looking at based off of our previously remediated issues, can we build a resilient security regression test based off of that so that we know that specific path doesn't become reintroduced? So one of the things that, can often happen is that we have, which I've seen several times as well, is that we added a fix to a new version of a service. Let's call it like payments like 2.4, right? That has the new version of it. And then we're like, cool, remediated. And then we go into our ticket, we tested it, and we marked it as closed. A week or two passes by, and there's an incident that security has no idea about because it's not a security incident, so they're not involved. So what was the resolution? Revert from 2.4 back to 2.3 that has the vulnerability again. And to us, everything's happy dandy. Our ticket is closed, but we don't care.
I see.
And we move on with it.
Yeah, it's
And then we don't know how long this exists beyond that. So yeah, I think it comes down to like that first step of automating those previous tests, and then from there starting to build out custom testing that's tailored to our organization. So similar to when we're doing our pen tests, how can we set up control testing essentially, so that way as we're going through the different stages of development, as we go into production, we know that this control remains resilient, or the finding remains open. That's fine too, but at least we know it's there.
Yeah, I think it's sometimes super hard to just understand where the problem came from, how to adapt it. And I think custom tests is definitely something that we've seen a lot of, like I've seen a lot of usage for. Ideally, you don't need to build a custom test and everything can be handled by the algorithm continuous the ICD. But yeah, sometimes you do need to kind of describe the logic of an application in a simple way. I think it's just hard time sometimes for the security engineers. It's like, as you've described, it sounds like a startup on itself. So you don't always have time to go back and actually maintain those custom security tests. If you're in a new version, there's something else that comes out that you have to then go back and adapt to every version of that application. It's just super hard. And yeah, in this episode, I have a new question
Sure.
that I'm asking every guest in the season. So, what is your least favorite security buzzword and why?
Okay. Yeah, I would say my least favorite security buzzword would have to be shift left. And I think it came from very good intentions. When I had first started my career, then shift left was a huge craze, right? But I think although it's just a word, right? Language is very important. And I think what ends up happening when we emphasize this idea of shift left is that the expectations somehow morphed into, whether it was intended or not, the expectations somehow morphed into identify all vulnerabilities before they reach into production. And then if you don't find them, you've somehow screwed up.
Yeah.
And I think that became a really difficult, not only, I think it's a great goal to have. So I don't think that's the problem, right? But when we end up shifting so far left into now we start doing a lot of threat modeling and design reviews, I think those are great exercises to do. What teams I feel that overinvest in and are underinvesting in is they overinvest in the ability and execution of these threat models, which is a great thing to do, but they underinvest in tracking the effectiveness of those exercises, right? A lot of the times they'll just kind of report on, here are the number of reviews that we've done. Oh, here are the teams that we've worked with to do these things. But we're not tracking, unless you see a little bit more mature processes here, which I've seen as well in different organizations, where you then start to track the control output from these exercises and then also track their implementation along the way. Because if we can't track those two things, we actually can't report on any value other than we sunk some time into it. Maybe it took us 2 days, maybe it took us 5 days
Well,
to
not
do
even
a threat
valid
model.
to suck some time into this.
Yeah, and that's really hard to say that we've done a good job, right? But if we can say this is the amount of time we put into it, and this is the actual output that came from it, and here's the effectiveness of that, that's kind of a much stronger place for us to be in. And tracking those control implementations comes back down to resilient processes with engineering, and whether engineering has that component already or whether we can serve from security as a partner to mature that process with them, because there's a benefit for both of us to be able to track down from our design phase what are the things that we say are going to become work items from this discussion, from this large document that we put together, right? Tracking that whole component together, and then moving into the future with it, and then knowing that we do have work that we want to revisit and the future, because we said, oh, this is a low priority, we should definitely do it, but maybe later, right?
Yeah, a
Which
later
we'll
in the
forget.
year.
Yeah, later we'll forget.
Q5.
Exactly.
What was the most, like you mentioned efficiency quite a lot, like what was the most effective project or but a project that you, or solution that you've implemented that you would definitely recommend someone else who's listening to implement?
Yeah, I would say that it's actually not a tool itself. It's more of a process to demonstrate, and I think any security team can do this today. When it comes to a security program, and especially product security programs, the core of any change that happens comes back down to vulnerability management. Whether people like it or not, or whether they do it well or not, is separate, right? Because you have a lot of noise that comes from vuln management if you do an ineffective job. But one of the most common things that I'll see that teams are reporting on, and that I'll chat with as well, when they're coming to ask about these problems, is that they only report on the number of vulnerabilities they have, and then they report on vulnerabilities by priority, and then they report out of SLA. And
Yeah.
so for a lot of these teams, they think, well, let's shorten the SLA. That'll make it faster. That doesn't make anything faster. It actually just makes more things go out of SLA, because you're not really looking at what is the reason for it. So one of the first things that we started to do is that rather than just tracking out of SLA, we wanted to track something as basic as a deferral, right? If we
Okay.
can't meet this thing, we'll just simply add a tag that we've deferred it, and we're going to move the date as needed. If we wanted to measure SLA, you can still do that based off of what you have from your the average close date for these things, average open date, and then also based on your policy. So you just hard code it to that number in your dashboard. But by tracking deferrals, rather than now becoming a full out of SLA and we're pointing fingers at people saying, hey, you're not getting this done, the deferrals for us represent a partnership a communication partnership that we have, that we're in constant communication with our engineering teams about these issues. And they're committing new dates to it, right? And then what you'll end up seeing as a trend is that you'll see a specific team, or maybe 2-3 teams, are kind of the ones that are deferring the most of them. And does that mean they're doing a bad job? Absolutely not, right? This now opens a conversation for us to say, okay, is this not a priority because we don't understand whether or not the vulnerabilities we're providing are even useful, right? Because sometimes they're coming from tools that we haven't curated very well, and we just decided to dump them into our queue. So that's a security problem, right? We shouldn't have done that. And then the second one is like, no, these are valid. We know that these are, deterministic vulnerabilities with the clear steps to reproduce them, right? Maybe they come from our pen test. So we know exactly how to validate that this thing is still there, but we have different priorities coming from either leadership, or this is not something we have the resources to. So that allows us to go back to that conversation where if we say it's a requirement, then it's a non-negotiable. So if it's a non-negotiable, we need to work with our security leadership to then say, they're facing these problems here based off of what we've described from our policy. I look at policy as this is essentially the local laws of your organization, right? And so if you say that we need to do something about it, we also need to be able to understand what's the reason why we can't commit to this. And if you expect them to be able to meet this expectation, meet that requirement, we need to provide the appropriate resourcing for them to do so. So whether that is adjusting, how much time is spent in their sprints specifically on security. Some people kind of attempt that. Whether it's effective or not is a separate conversation. This really basic step allows us to then be able to form a stronger connection and stronger partnership. And then beyond that, moving forward is also going into our vulnerabilities and understanding whether or not the value of them, right? So that's something where you do need a little bit of security expertise, and I'll bring in a lot of my kind of pen testing background to
Mhm.
look at a vulnerability, look at its details, and either we did a terrible job documenting it and we need to do a better job, or we need to dig deeper to validate it, or maybe we have too many that we need to dig deeper into, and that's also another thing, right? But the ones that we know that are true problems that I could say, let me show you, let me demo you this thing and it's going to break. We know we should fix those, right? So it also comes back down to how we prioritize and what our prioritization engine and parameters look like.
Yeah, I think everyone just ends up having more skin in the game, by actually being involved in this process, like you mentioned, like communication. And because of that communication, like everyone is kind of being responsible for each of the parts. But yeah, it was a great example, and I hope someone was
Yeah.
will actually relook what they need to track and maybe adapt it internally. Thank you so much, Max, for coming on the show. It was a pleasure chatting with you. And yeah, it was great.
Yeah. Thanks for having me. I had a great time chatting about these things.